the rescue and the awakening. The hospital corridors buzzed with their usual blend of urgency and precision, punctuated by the steady beeping of machines and the hurried clatter of wheels against polished floors. Dr. Elijah Carter, standing tall in his scrubs, was a figure of calm amidst the chaos. His presence commanded respect, not through arrogance, but through the quiet assurance of someone who had faced countless battles and emerged stronger each time. That night, however, was different. The emergency room doors burst open, and paramedics rushed in, wheeling a stretcher that carried a frail, unconscious woman. Her pale face was etched with lines of age, her hands clutching at a blood-soaked scarf around her midsection. The lead paramedic barked out details: 74-year-old female. Abdominal aortic aneurysm rupture. BP dropping fast. We're losing her. Elijah was already moving. His sharp eyes took in every detail, from the erratic heart monitor readings to the waxy pallor of her skin. Prep the OR. We don't have time to waste, he ordered, his voice steady but firm. As the team scrambled, one of the nurses leaned in and whispered, "That's Margaret Whitmore. She's notorious in this town. Runs those rallies, the anti-immigration, anti-everything ones." Elijah paused for a fraction of a second, the name hitting him like a cold wind. Margaret Whitmore, a woman whose face he'd seen on flyers. Her words laced with venomous vitriol against minorities, immigrants, and people who looked like him. But in that moment, the patient wasn't a symbol of hatred, she was simply a human being clinging to life. "Let's move," he said, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was electric. Nurses and assistants moved with synchronized precision, their trust in Elijah palpable. The rupture was severe, the blood loss catastrophic. Each second felt like a lifetime as Elijah worked tirelessly to repair the damage. Sweat dripped from his brow, but his hands never wavered. At one point, the anesthesiologist murmured, "Her vitals are crashing." Elijah didn't look up, clamped the artery. Now, the room held its collective breath as Elijah worked through what seemed like an impossible maze of ruptured vessels and tissue. Every decision was critical, every action a potential life or death choice. "Got it," he finally said, his voice cutting through the tension. The monitors began to stabilize, the frantic beeping slowing to a steadier rhythm. Relief washed over the team. But Elijah remained focused, finishing the procedure with the meticulous care that defined his career. When it was over, he stepped back, exhaled deeply, and looked at the team. "She's stable, for now. Let's get her to recovery." The next morning, Elijah made his rounds, his exhaustion hidden behind a practiced calm. Margaret had been moved to the ICU, her face ashen but her breathing steady. Standing by her bedside, he reviewed her charts. The surgery had been a success, but her road to recovery would be long. A faint rustling made him look up. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, their steel-gray gaze landing on Elijah. For a brief moment, there was confusion, then clarity, and then recognition. "You," her voice was hoarse but sharp. "Get away from me." Elijah's expression remained neutral. "Mrs. Whitmore, you've been through a major surgery. I'm Dr. Carter. I performed the operation that saved your life." Her lips curled into a weak but unmistakable sneer. "Saved? Don't flatter yourself. Boy, you probably botched it." The venom in her words stung. But Elijah had heard worse. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady. "The team and I did everything possible to ensure your survival. Rest is critical for your recovery." Margaret turned her head away as if his presence was physically repellent. "I don't need a lecture from someone like you. Go find someone else to experiment on." Elijah stepped back, his professionalism intact, though his chest felt tight. He had faced racism before, glares, muttered slurs, even overt confrontations, but there was something uniquely cutting about this moment. He had poured his skill, his time, his very being into saving her, only to be met with disdain. The days that followed were no easier. Margaret grew stronger physically, but her animosity toward Elijah only intensified. Every interaction was an opportunity for her to belittle him. She accused him of being careless, of not explaining her condition properly, of making decisions without her consent, despite being unconscious when he made them. She even insinuated that he had endangered her life intentionally. Elijah's colleagues noticed. Some offered quiet words of encouragement, while others avoided the topic altogether, uncomfortable with the racial undercurrent of her accusations. One day, after another particularly vitriolic encounter with Margaret, a younger nurse approached Elijah. "Dr. Carter, I don't know how you do it. She's awful to you, and you're still so composed." Elijah gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "The job isn't about how people treat me. It's about how I treat them." The situation escalated when Margaret's family got involved. Her son, a sharp-suited man with a penchant for theatrics, stormed into the hospital demanding to see Elijah. "I don't care what you think you've done for my mother," he snapped, jabbing a finger at Elijah. "She says you were reckless. And I believe her." Elijah remained calm, explaining the procedure in detail and the decisions he had made. But the man wasn't interested in explanations. "We'll be talking to our lawyers," he said before storming out. That night, Elijah sat alone in his office, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought of his mentors, of the sacrifices he had made to be here, and of the countless patients who had thanked him with tears in their eyes. He reminded himself that those moments mattered more than the hatred of one woman. Still, a question lingered. How much could one person endure? The turning point came unexpectedly. Margaret suffered a minor complication, unrelated to the surgery, and Elijah was called to her bedside once again. This time, she didn't fight him. Perhaps it was the pain or the realization that she had no one else to rely on in that moment. As he adjusted her medication, she muttered something barely audible. "I didn't ask for you to save me." Elijah paused, meeting her gaze. "No one asks to be saved, Mrs. Whitmore, but everyone deserves a chance." For the first time, she didn't respond with a retort. Instead, she turned her face away. Silent, the hospital's chaos surged in waves that night. The emergency room doors swung open, revealing Margaret Whitmore, lifeless and pale, her body barely hanging on. The paramedics were shouting over the commotion. 74-year-old female. Massive blood loss from a ruptured aneurysm. BP critical, 56/30. She's circling the drain. The gurney rolled through like a storm. Doctors and nurses scrambled into action, the intensity palpable as they prepared for an operation that could only be described as a fight against time. Dr. Elijah Carter, calm yet commanding, entered the scene like a general stepping onto a battlefield. His sharp eyes scanned the monitors and assessed her condition in seconds. Years of experience told him this was one of those cases where hesitation equaled death. "Page the surgical team and prep the OR. She's going under in 10 minutes," he ordered, as the team moved with urgency. Nurse Ramirez approached Elijah with hesitation. Her voice dropped to a whisper, her expression uneasy. "Dr. Carter, do you know who she is?" Elijah's brows furrowed. "Should I?" "She's Margaret Whitmore," Ramirez said, glancing nervously toward the patient. She's notorious around here. Big name in those far-right rallies. She's the one who filed that petition to keep minorities out of the neighborhood. You've seen the flyers." The name landed like a heavy stone in Elijah's chest, followed by a fleeting but sharp memory. Whitmore's image on posters plastered across the city. Her words venomous and unyielding. Her rhetoric had targeted people like him, black professionals, immigrants, anyone who didn't fit her narrow worldview. And now, here she was, on the brink of death, depending on the hands of a man she likely despised. For a brief moment, an invisible weight pressed against Elijah's chest. Not anger, not even resentment, just a deep, hollow ache. He glanced at the unconscious woman on the gurney, tubes snaking across her fragile frame. Hate had brought her to his attention before, but now, she was merely a patient, a human being. "We're surgeons, not judges," Elijah muttered under his breath. "Let's get her into the OR." Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was tense. Elijah worked with the precision of a master craftsman, his hands steady as they navigated the complex vascular repair. But this wasn't a routine operation. The aneurysm had ruptured in one of the most dangerous areas, the abdominal aorta, a literal ticking time bomb. "Vitals dropping," called the anesthesiologist, his voice tinged with worry. Elijah remained focused. "Clamp the artery now. We're going to bypass the rupture." The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Blood loss was immense, the tissues slippery and incooperative. Twice, the monitors flatlined, and twice, Elijah's team revived her. Each time, Elijah pushed harder, fought harder. The room was a battleground of expertise against the inevitable. "More suction. Hold the clamp steady," he ordered, his voice calm but carrying the weight of life and death. His hands moved with a determination that silenced the room. Every incision, every stitch, every decision carried purpose. When he finally sutured the last cut, the silence broke only with the steady rhythm of her pulse returning on the monitor. "Vitals are stabilizing," a nurse announced. Elijah stepped back, his gloves slick with blood, his breathing heavy. Relief swept through the room. But Elijah's focus remained sharp. "Good work, everyone. Let's get her to recovery." In the days that followed, Margaret's condition improved physically, though her spirit remained combative. She woke from her sedation on the second morning, her gray eyes scanning the sterile room. Elijah arrived for his rounds, clipboard in hand, his demeanor as professional as ever. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he began. "I'm Dr. Carter. I performed your surgery. You're recovering well, though there are some precautions we need to." Her voice, weak but laced with venom, cut him off. You were the one?" Elijah blinked, taken aback by her tone. "Yes, I was. You suffered a ruptured aneurysm. It was a complex surgery. But me." She spat, her voice rising despite her frailty. "What were they thinking? Letting someone like you touch me?" The words landed like sharp stones. Elijah's chest tightened, but his expression remained neutral. Years of enduring prejudice had taught him to let the slurs roll off his back, though their sting never fully faded. "I assure you, Mrs. Whitmore, my team and I acted with your best interests in mind," Elijah said, his voice measured. She scoffed, her lip curling in disgust. "Best interests? Or were you just practicing? I didn't ask for your help." For a moment, Elijah stood silent. He could feel the nurses nearby, their eyes darting between him and the patient. Margaret's words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Finally, Elijah spoke, his tone firm but calm. "No one asks to be saved, Mrs. Whitmore, but as a doctor, it's my duty to save lives, no matter whose they are." He turned and left the room before she could reply, though her muttered insult echoed in his mind. The days turned into a grueling routine. Every interaction with Margaret was another round of insults, accusations, and disdain. She refused to let him near her unless absolutely necessary. And even then, her contempt was palpable. At one point, she summoned her son, Charles Whitmore, a sharp-tongued lawyer with a reputation for his theatrics in court. He arrived at the hospital, demanding to see Elijah. "Dr. Carter, is it?" Charles said, his voice dripping with contempt. "My mother tells me you've been mishandling her care." Elijah, ever composed, nodded. "I'm overseeing her recovery. If you have specific concerns, I'd be happy to address them." Charles leaned in, his tone icy. "My concern is that you're out of your depth. My mother deserves the best, and I'm not sure someone like you qualifies." Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "Your mother's condition was critical. The surgery was performed successfully, and her recovery is on track. I'll let my record speak for itself." But Charles wasn't interested in reason. "We'll see about that," he hissed. "Don't get comfortable, doctor. Lawyers will be involved." That evening, Elijah found himself alone in his office, the day's weight pressing down on him. The hospital lights outside his window glimmered faintly, their glow muted by his exhaustion. He thought of the many patients he had saved, the gratitude in their eyes, the letters and flowers they had sent. But Margaret's hatred felt heavier than all their thanks combined. He thought of the path he'd walked to get here, the racism he had faced in med school, the extra mile he always had to run to prove himself. This wasn't new, yet it felt sharper somehow. It wasn't just about her hatred. It was about what it represented, a society that still saw him as less. Despite all he had accomplished, a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Nurse Ramirez. She stepped in hesitantly, her face a mix of worry and admiration. "Dr. Carter, you're incredible. You know that?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Not feeling very incredible right now." She stepped closer. "You saved her life, and you've been nothing but professional. Even when she's treated you horribly. That's incredible." Elijah looked down, the faintest glimmer of a smile crossing his lips. "Thanks, Ramirez. That means a lot." But as she left, he looked back at the empty desk before him, the storm outside growing louder. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And the storm was only just beginning the morning after Margaret Whitmore was discharged. The hospital's hallways were unusually quiet. Whispers traveled between staff, patients, and visitors like an undercurrent. The word had spread. Margaret Whitmore, infamous for her racist tirades, had accused Dr. Elijah Carter, the very man who had saved her life, of malpractice. It started with a formal complaint. Margaret claimed Elijah had botched her surgery, leaving her in unnecessary pain and at risk of permanent complications. But her written words hinted at something deeper. Phrases like unqualified and reckless left no doubt about the racial undertones. Within days, the news exploded at first. It was confined to local outlets. Headlines like prominent activist claims botched surgery and doctor under fire for alleged malpractice appeared in newspapers. But soon, national media picked up the story, framing it as a racial controversy. Social media erupted. Margaret's supporters flooded comment sections, their posts dripping with hate. Fueled by bigotry and their loyalty to her, they shared doctored photos, false testimonies from supposed witnesses, and baseless rumors about Elijah's past. On the other side, Elijah's defenders rallied behind him. Former patients shared their gratitude, calling him the best doctor they'd ever had. Colleagues posted about his professionalism and unwavering dedication. The hospital became a battlefield of ideologies. Protesters gathered outside, some holding signs that read, "Justice for Margaret," while others carried ones that said, "Support Dr. Carter, a true hero." Inside the hospital, Elijah tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He still performed surgeries, attended rounds, and spoke with patients as if nothing was happening. But the stares from staff and the whispers in the hallways reminded him that the world was watching. One night, Elijah's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, text messages, emails, even missed calls. He finally opened one of the messages from his sister, Naomi, a civil rights attorney. "Elijah, are you okay? You need to see this." Attached was a link to a video. It was a poorly edited compilation of clips from hospital footage, twisted to make it seem as though Elijah had mishandled Margaret's case. The voiceover accused him of targeting white patients and letting racial bias cloud his judgment. Below the video, comments poured in. Some were supportive, but many were vile. "This is why people like him shouldn't be doctors. He probably got into med school because of quotas. I wouldn't let him near my dog, let alone my family." Elijah put his phone down, his hands trembling slightly. For all his resilience, the hate was beginning to seep in. It wasn't just an attack on his skills, it was an attack on his identity, his worth, his very existence. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from his father, a retired school principal who had fought his own battles against racism in his career. The message was simple: "Proud of you. Stay strong, son." It was enough to pull Elijah back from the brink. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and prepared for what was to come. The hospital's legal team initially believed the case would fizzle out. Margaret's accusations lacked substance, and the medical records showed that Elijah's surgery had been not only appropriate but life-saving. But Margaret's son, Charles Whitmore, a seasoned lawyer with a reputation for theatrics, had other plans. Margaret officially filed a lawsuit against Elijah and the hospital, claiming negligence, improper care, and emotional distress. The lawsuit sought financial damages and, more insidiously, an investigation into the hospital's hiring practices, implying that Elijah's position was a result of affirmative action rather than merit. Elijah sat in a conference room with the hospital's legal team and his attorney, Rebecca Stern, a no-nonsense litigator with a sharp mind and an unwavering commitment to justice. Rebecca laid it out plainly. "This case isn't about malpractice," she said, her tone clipped but empathetic. "It's about racism. Charles Whitmore doesn't care about the truth, he cares about headlines. We need to prepare for a smear campaign." Elijah nodded. "I'm ready." But was he? He wasn't sure anymore. The stakes were higher than just his career. This trial wasn't just about him. It was about what he represented to so many others. The trial began 2 months later. In a packed courtroom, reporters jostled for seats, their cameras flashing as Elijah entered, flanked by Rebecca and his supporters. Margaret sat on the other side, frail but resolute, with Charles whispering in her ear. Charles wasted no time painting Elijah as an incompetent surgeon. He called witnesses, Margaret's family doctor, a former hospital employee who had a grudge against Elijah, and even a so-called expert who twisted the surgical records to suggest negligence. The prosecution leaned heavily on racial stereotypes, insinuating that Elijah's background made him less trustworthy, less capable. They showed manipulated footage of the surgery room, taken out of context, to suggest chaos and incompetence. But Rebecca was a force to be reckoned with. She methodically dismantled the prosecution's arguments. Piece by piece, she presented the unedited medical records, which showed Elijah's flawless execution of the procedure. She called on nurses and staff who had witnessed the surgery, their testimonies highlighting Elijah's skill and professionalism. And then, the turning point, Rebecca called Nurse Ramirez to the stand. The younger nurse had been hesitant, afraid of the media spotlight, but she knew the truth needed to be told. Before the surgery, Ramirez began, her voice steady. Mrs. Whitmore was conscious for a brief moment. She told me not to let that black doctor touch her. She said she'd rather die. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Elijah kept his face impassive, though his heart ached. He hadn't known about this. Why didn't you report this sooner? Charles demanded during cross-examination. I was scared, Ramirez admitted, but I'm here now because Dr. Carter deserves the truth to be known. He saved her life. That's all that matters. The jury deliberated for 3 tense days. Elijah barely slept, his mind replaying every moment of the trial. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent. On all counts, we find the defendant, Dr. Elijah Carter, not guilty. Relief swept through the room like a wave. Elijah exhaled deeply, his composure breaking for just a moment as he closed his eyes. The weight he had carried for months lifted slightly, though it left behind scars he knew would take years to heal. Margaret sat silently, her face unreadable. Charles muttered something under his breath. His theatrical confidence deflated. Outside, supporters cheered. Former patients and colleagues approached Elijah, hugging him, shaking his hand, thanking him for his resilience. But Elijah's eyes were drawn to the protesters still gathered outside. Even in victory, the battle felt far from over back at home. Elijah sat alone in his living room. The cheers, the interviews, the celebratory words, all of it felt distant now. He thought about Margaret, about her hatred, and about the effort it had taken to save her life despite everything. He thought about the hundreds of patients who had thanked him, whose lives he had changed. Yet one woman's hatred had nearly destroyed him. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Rebecca. You did it. Rest up. We'll talk strategy tomorrow. This isn't the end of the fight. Elijah smiled faintly. She was right. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a larger battle for justice, for equality, for the right to exist and excel without fear. The storm had passed, but Elijah knew there were more storms ahead, and he would be ready. The fallout from Margaret Whitmore's accusations struck the hospital like a thunderclap. For a place that prided itself on professionalism and excellence, the scandal brought an unfamiliar, chaotic energy. Staff whispered in break rooms, phones buzzed with notifications, and Elijah Carter found himself at the eye of a storm he hadn't asked for. The official complaint landed on his desk just 3 days after Margaret's discharge. The language was precise but unmistakably laced with venom. She accused him of negligence, reckless disregard for her health, and unprofessional conduct. Buried within the formal language, however, were phrases that hinted at deeper prejudice, references to his questionable qualifications, and implications about his attitude during her care. Elijah read it twice, his stomach tightening with every line. He'd spent years building a career that transcended stereotypes and systemic barriers, only to find himself reduced, once again, to someone defending his right to exist in the room by the end of the week. The story had spilled into the public sphere. Margaret's son, Charles Whitmore, was a savvy manipulator of public opinion, armed with a sharp tongue and a flair for theatrics. He fed the media a narrative of an arrogant surgeon who had ignored protocol and endangered his mother's life. News outlets pounced on the story. Headlines screamed, "Whitmore family files malpractice suit against black surgeon. Community leader alleges mistreatment in high-stakes surgery." Racial tensions erupt in controversial hospital case. Social media became a battleground. On one side were those who supported Elijah, sharing stories of how he had saved lives and inspired trust. On the other were Margaret's supporters, spewing vitriol and conspiracy theories. The comments turned vicious quickly. "She's lucky she survived. How did this guy even get his license? Affirmative action strikes again. Maybe next time. Let her choose her surgeon. Elijah refused to read the comments. But the weight of the headlines was inescapable. Patients began canceling appointments, citing vague concerns. Even colleagues who had once praised him now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Their silence louder than words. The professional attacks were one thing, but the personal fallout cut deeper. Elijah's parents called daily, their voices filled with a mix of pride and worry. His father, a retired principal, was stoic but firm. "Son, you faced bigger challenges than this," he said during one call. "This is just another fight. And you'll win." But his mother's voice carried a tremor of fear. "Elijah, I don't trust these people. They'll twist everything you've done into something ugly. Promise me you'll take care of yourself." His sister, Naomi, who had built a career as a civil rights attorney, was less restrained. "They're coming for you because you represent everything they fear," she told him. "This isn't just about you or Margaret Whitmore. It's about what you symbolize." Despite their support, Elijah felt increasingly isolated. Threatening emails began flooding his inbox. Some filled with slurs, others with veiled warnings. Protesters gathered outside the hospital, their signs stark in their opposition. "Justice for Margaret. End racism in healthcare." But right beside them were his supporters. "Stand with Dr. Carter. Equal care for all." The sight of the divided crowd outside the hospital's glass doors made his chest tighten. He'd sworn an oath to save lives. Yet here he was, caught in a battle that seemed to have nothing to do with medicine. The formal lawsuit arrived 2 weeks later, served with the kind of pomp Charles Whitmore loved to display. Margaret was suing both Elijah and the hospital for malpractice, citing negligence, emotional distress, and long-term health complications. But the real sting was in the subtext of the case, the implication that Elijah was unfit to practice medicine. Elijah met with his lawyer, Rebecca Stern, in a quiet conference room at the hospital. Rebecca was sharp, no nonsense, and fiercely intelligent, a woman who had built her reputation dismantling cases just like this. She sat across from Elijah, her notebook filled with meticulous notes. "This case isn't about the surgery," Rebecca said, flipping through the complaint. "The records are clear, you performed flawlessly. This is about their perception of you. They're trying to discredit you because you don't fit their image of a trusted doctor." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "We're not just fighting for your career. We're fighting for every patient you've ever saved, and every doctor who looks like you." Elijah nodded, though the weight of her words felt heavy. "What's our strategy?" Rebecca smiled grimly. "We dismantle their case piece by piece. And when we're done, we make sure they think twice before trying this again." The trial began on a cold, gray morning, the kind of day that felt suspended in time. The courtroom was packed, reporters jostling for seats, their cameras clicking as Elijah entered. Margaret sat on the plaintiff's side, her frail figure accentuated by her shawl. Charles, ever the showman, whispered in her ear, his expression confident. The prosecution wasted no time painting Elijah as a reckless surgeon. Charles called on witnesses, Margaret's family doctor, who suggested that another surgeon might have handled the case better, a former hospital employee, who claimed Elijah had a history of cutting corners, and a self-proclaimed expert who twisted the surgical records to suggest negligence. Rebecca countered every point with calm precision. She presented unedited medical records, showing the critical decisions Elijah had made to save Margaret's life. She called on nurses and staff who had been in the operating room, their testimonies highlighting Elijah's skill and composure. But the moment that changed everything came when Rebecca called Nurse Ramirez to the stand. Ramirez had been hesitant to testify, afraid of retaliation, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. Before the surgery, Ramirez began, her voice trembling slightly. "Mrs. Whitmore regained consciousness for a brief moment. She told me not to let that black doctor touch her." A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Rebecca let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "And what did Dr. Carter do?" Ramirez's voice steadied. "He saved her life. He didn't hesitate. He treated her with the same care and professionalism he shows to every patient." Charles tried to discredit Ramirez, but her testimony was a turning point. The courtroom buzzed with energy as Rebecca made her closing argument. A fiery defense of Elijah's integrity, skill, and humanity. The jury deliberated for 3 long days. Every hour felt like a lifetime to Elijah. who spent the time pacing his apartment, rereading notes, and replaying the trial in his mind. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was silent as the foreman stood. On all counts, we find the defendant, Dr. Elijah Carter, not guilty. Relief washed over Elijah like a wave. He exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging as months of tension released in an instant. Margaret sat in stunned silence, her face pale. Charles clenched his jaw, his confidence shattered. Outside, the crowd erupted. Elijah's supporters cheered, their voices ringing out in victory. But as Elijah stepped out into the sunlight, he saw the other side too, Margaret's supporters. Their faces twisted with anger, their signs still raised high. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. That night, Elijah sat alone in his apartment, the verdict still echoing in his mind. He should have felt triumphant, but all he felt was exhaustion. The fight had taken something from him, something he wasn't sure he could get back. His phone buzzed, a text from Rebecca. "You did it. Rest now. But remember, this is just the beginning." Elijah stared at the message, the weight of her words sinking in. She was right. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving that he belonged, that he had earned his place, and that no one, not Margaret, not Charles, not the protesters outside, could take that from him. As he sat in the quiet of his apartment, Elijah made a decision. This fight wasn't over. It was only the beginning of a larger battle for justice, equality, and the right to heal without fear. And he was ready. The courtroom victory left a mixture of emotions in its wake. Dr. Elijah Carter had been vindicated, his innocence proven, but the weight of the ordeal lingered. The cheers from supporters outside the courthouse and the vindication of the verdict couldn't erase the months of hate, the sleepless nights, or the moments when he'd questioned his place in the world the morning after the trial. Elijah walked into the hospital with mixed feelings. The corridors buzzed with subdued energy. Some colleagues greeted him warmly, their handshakes firmer, their smiles brighter. Others avoided his gaze, offering only perfunctory nods. The divide was still there, less visible, perhaps, but just as present. A meeting with the hospital board was scheduled that afternoon. Elijah expected it to be routine, but when he entered the conference room, he was surprised to find a mix of board members, colleagues, and even a few nurses waiting for him. The board chair, a stoic man named Dr. William Grant, stood and addressed the room. "Elijah," Dr. Grant began, his voice steady, "you've endured more than anyone should have to. This hospital owes you not just an apology, but its gratitude. You stood firm in the face of injustice, and you upheld the principles we all aspire to. On behalf of the board, I want to say, thank you." The room erupted in applause. Elijah's chest tightened. For months, he'd been bracing himself against a world that seemed determined to tear him down. This acknowledgement, though overdue, felt like a small salve on a deep wound. But as the applause faded, Elijah stood and addressed the room. "I appreciate your support," he said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "But gratitude isn't enough. We need to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen again, to anyone. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, has no place in this hospital, or in medicine. We owe that to our patients and to each other." The room fell silent. Dr. Grant nodded solemnly. "You're right, Elijah. Let's make sure we live up to that." A week after the trial, a handwritten envelope arrived at Elijah's office. The sender's name stopped him in his tracks, Margaret Whitmore. For a long moment, he stared at the envelope, debating whether to open it. Part of him didn't want to. Hadn't he endured enough? But curiosity, and perhaps a sliver of hope, compelled him. He opened the letter, his hands steady but his heart racing. Margaret's handwriting was neat but shaky, the words spilling out with unexpected vulnerability. "Dr. Carter, I didn't want to write this letter. Pride, as you might imagine, is something I've never lacked. But after everything, I find myself haunted by what I saw in that courtroom, not just the evidence, but you, the dignity, the professionalism, the restraint you showed. You had every reason to hate me, to let me die on that table. But you didn't. You saved my life. I've spent my life believing in things I now realize were built on fear and ignorance. And while I can't change the harm I've done, I want you to know that I'm trying to change myself. For whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. Margaret Whitmore." Elijah read the letter twice, his emotions a swirl of disbelief, anger, and, oddly, compassion. Could someone like Margaret truly change? Did her apology mean anything after the pain she'd caused? He placed the letter in a drawer, unresolved but unwilling to dismiss it entirely. The months following the trial were transformative. Elijah, determined to channel his experience into something meaningful, began advocating for systemic change in medicine. He partnered with the hospital to create a diversity and equity task force, aimed at addressing biases in patient care and hiring practices. He also started speaking at medical schools, sharing his story with aspiring doctors. Your skill will be questioned, he told them during one lecture. Your place in the room will be doubted. But never let anyone define your worth. Let your work speak for you. One of the students, a young black woman named Aisha, approached him after a lecture. Dr. Carter, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Hearing you speak, it's the reason I know I can do this. Thank you. Her words stayed with him. For every insult, for every threat, moments like this made it worth continuing the fight. Elijah's renewed purpose didn't come without challenges. The hospital's task force faced resistance from some staff who dismissed it as unnecessary or divisive. Anonymous complaints accused Elijah of pushing a political agenda. But Elijah pressed on, his resolve unwavering. He knew that change was never easy, especially in institutions steeped in tradition. Progress, he often said, isn't about comfort, it's about courage. Months after the trial, Elijah received an unexpected visitor, Margaret Whitmore. She arrived at the hospital unannounced, her frail figure supported by a cane. The receptionist, unsure how to proceed, called Elijah's office. When he entered the lobby, Margaret looked up, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she extended her hand, trembling but determined. Dr. Carter, she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Thank you. Elijah hesitated before taking her hand. It wasn't forgiveness, it was acknowledgement. A step toward something neither of them fully understood but knew was necessary a year after the trial. Elijah stood on a stage, addressing an audience of medical professionals at a national conference. His presentation, titled, Healing Beyond the Scalpel, Addressing Bias in Medicine, was a call to action. He shared his story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to resilience and the need for systemic change. He spoke of the patients who'd inspired him, the colleagues who'd stood by him, and the moments that had tested his faith in humanity. As he concluded, the audience rose to their feet in applause. Elijah looked out at the sea of faces, diverse, hopeful, determined, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. That night, as he returned to his office, he found Aisha's first published research paper waiting in his inbox. The title, The Legacy of Resilience, Redefining Leadership in Medicine. He smiled, knowing the fight wasn't over but confident that the next generation was ready to carry the torch. Elijah returned to the operating room, where he felt most at home. The hum of machines, the sterile smell, the quiet focus of his team, it was where he belonged. As he scrubbed in for his next surgery, he glanced at the clock and took a deep breath. The patient's life lay in his hands, just as Margaret Whitmore's had. But this time, there was no weight of hatred, no storm of judgment. There was only the steady, unyielding resolve to heal, because that's what he was born to do. And as he made the first incision, Elijah Carter carried with him the scars of his journey, not as burdens, but as badges of strength. Reminders of what it meant to truly heal. The weeks following the trial were a strange paradox for Dr. Elijah Carter. The courtroom victory, though public and definitive, felt hollow in its aftermath. He was back to performing surgeries, consulting patients, and attending rounds, but the weight of the ordeal lingered. He had survived the storm, yet its echoes followed him. Elijah's work ethic had always been unrelenting, but now it felt like armor. Each life he saved, each complication he solved, was a quiet rebuttal to the accusations that had sought to destroy him. But in the quiet moments, late nights in his apartment or early mornings driving to work, he felt the cracks forming. His phone buzzed constantly. Supportive texts from friends, messages from former patients, media requests for interviews, and even apologies from distant acquaintances who hadn't spoken out during the trial. Yet among these were darker messages, veiled threats, hateful slurs, and reminders that, for some, the verdict would never be enough. One evening, while reviewing a surgical plan, Elijah's phone pinged with an email. The subject line read, "From Margaret Whitmore." He froze, his pulse quickening. The email contained a scanned letter in Margaret's shaky handwriting. Dr. Carter. The letter began, "I'm writing because I don't know how else to face what I've done. During the trial, I clung to my pride, my anger, and my fear. But now, in the quiet of my home, I'm haunted by what I saw in you. You stood firm when you had every reason to walk away. You showed me what integrity looks like. And for that, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you gratitude." Margaret continued, confessing that her worldview had been shaped by fear and ignorance. She admitted that seeing Elijah's unwavering professionalism, even in the face of her hatred, had forced her to confront truths she had long avoided. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter concluded, "but I needed you to know that your courage has changed something in me. For what it's worth, I am sorry." Elijah read the letter twice. Part of him wanted to crumple it up, to dismiss it as too little, too late, but another part, the doctor, the healer, wondered if perhaps it was a start the letter weighed on him. But it also fueled something new, a determination to use his experience as a catalyst for change. At the hospital, he proposed the creation of a diversity and equity task force, aimed at addressing implicit biases in patient care, staff hiring, and workplace culture. The proposal wasn't universally welcomed. At a board meeting, one senior surgeon scoffed, "Are we really saying our hospital has a problem with racism? This feels unnecessary." Elijah remained calm but firm. "I'm saying that every institution has blind spots. Acknowledging them isn't weakness, it's strength. If we don't address these issues, we fail our patients and each other." The task force was approved, though not without resistance. Elijah was appointed its chair, and within weeks, he began organizing workshops, inviting guest speakers, and creating platforms for open dialogue. The work was exhausting, but for the first time since the trial, Elijah felt like he was building something that mattered. Not everyone was ready to accept change. One afternoon, Elijah was approached by Dr. Peter Langston, a senior surgeon with decades of experience. Langston had been vocal in his skepticism about the task force and Elijah's leadership. "I respect your skills, Elijah," Langston began, his tone cold, "but don't you think you're overcorrecting? Not everything is about race." Elijah set down the patient file he'd been reviewing. "Peter, this isn't about overcorrecting, it's about ensuring that every patient, regardless of who they are, receives the best care possible. It's about creating a workplace where everyone feels valued." Langston's lips thinned. "Some of us think this is just a political agenda." Elijah's gaze hardened, though his voice remained steady. "And some of us think that ensuring fairness and equity isn't political, it's human. If you can't see that, maybe it's time to examine why." The conversation left Elijah shaken but resolute. He knew the road ahead would be fraught with resistance, but he also knew it was worth walking. One rainy afternoon, months after the trial, Elijah was reviewing charts when his assistant knocked on the door. "Dr. Carter, you have a visitor. She says her name is Margaret Whitmore." Elijah felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't expected to see her again, not in person. He stepped into the lobby to find Margaret, frailer than he remembered, leaning heavily on a cane. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no hostility in her gaze. "Dr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling, "I don't know if I have the right to be here, but I needed to see you." Elijah studied her for a moment, then gestured toward a nearby seating area. They sat in silence for a few moments before Margaret spoke again. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice breaking, "not just for saving my life, but for showing me a strength I didn't deserve to witness. I've spent my life clinging to hate. But you gave me grace when I gave you nothing." Elijah listened, his emotions a complex mix of empathy and guardedness. "Margaret," he said finally, "it's not about what you gave me. It's about what we choose to give others, even when they don't deserve it." Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded. "I'm trying to be better. I know it's too late to undo the harm I've caused, but I want you to know, I'll spend the rest of my life trying." Elijah didn't respond immediately. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and it wasn't automatic, but he nodded, offering her a small measure of the humanity she had denied him for so long. As the task force gained momentum, so did Elijah's reputation as a leader and advocate. He began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, medical schools, and community events. His story became a rallying cry for change, not just in medicine, but in society. At one such event, a young black medical student approached him. Her name was Aisha, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "Dr. Carter, your story is the reason I didn't give up on med school. Thank you for showing us that we belong." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Aisha, you don't just belong, you're essential. Remember that." One evening, Elijah sat in his office, a stack of patient charts before him. The hospital was quiet, the hum of machines a comforting rhythm. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, the hatred he'd faced, the battles he'd fought, and the lives he'd saved. He opened his drawer and took out Margaret's letter. Rereading her words, they still carried the weight of her regret, but they also reminded him of the power of change. Elijah folded the letter and placed it back in the drawer. He wasn't sure if he would ever fully forgive Margaret, but he knew he didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't the end goal, growth was. In the operating room the next morning, Elijah prepared for another surgery. His team moved with practiced precision, their trust in him evident in every action. As he scrubbed in, Elijah glanced at the clock and took a deep breath. The patient's life lay in his hands, just as Margaret Whitmore's had. But this time, there was no weight of hatred, no storm of judgment. There was only the steady, unyielding resolve to heal, because that was who he was. And as he made the first incision, Elijah Carter carried with him the scars of his journey, not as burdens, but as proof of the strength it took to turn pain into purpose.